especially delighted to introduce our speaker tonight because I think that it is no coincidence that I get to introduce a man who's now a voice that is raising some concerns about the current models that we have followed to deal with the challenge of poverty and to achieve human flourishing in our communities. He has been helping a lot of organizations over the past 40 years. He's a member of the CCDA board since 1989. And I can tell you that I met him today and I'm already inspired by him. I work in poverty cure and I want to share with you a little bit of the story, what brought me here. I grew up in Nicaragua, and when I was there, I thought that if I could find a way to provide things to people that I saw suffering in poverty there, I would end up their suffering. And it's very funny because the Lord took me on a journey along my life. He brought me to an investment promotion agency. He brought me to the Ministry of Tourism back at home. And I learned that giving a handout to that person in need wasn't the answer, wasn't God's plan for that person. And it wasn't God's plan, not only because you need to have people producing those bags of the time to give them away, but also, and most importantly, because we are made in the image and likeness of God, like Immaculate says in that video. And we have received a responsibility, we have received talents, and we are to use them. And I think that that is beautiful of the CCDA model, the recognition of who we are in the eyes of God, of who we should be when we look at one another, the gifts and talents that we bring to our communities. And so what I learned over time is that business and jobs are a big part of the solution when we think of community development, or when we think of human flourishing. And that is what we show you in our DVD series. Poverty Cure has become a movement over the past few years. What started as a wish, to present a new way of thinking to people has turned into a network now of over 180 organizations that are working in 144 countries. We decided to present these ideas to organizations that are on the ground, and we are already shaping the way that they are doing their work. We have a documentary that is coming out this year. The DVD series that you saw now is being used in over 30 universities in the US and abroad. We have Spanish subtitles for it and French subtitles. And we have many churches too that are using it. And we are just motivated a lot when we hear the responses we get from the people, that when they hear the stories of everybody, because we filmed it in 20 countries and conducted 150 interviews to complete it. When we hear that, people feel motivated into being part of this change. So Dr. Bob Lupton is the author of Toxic Charity, and if you haven't picked up his book, I highly recommend it. He has worked, as I said, for over 40 years in urban ministry, and he's putting before us a lot of lessons that he has acquired over the years. He's presenting a lot of practical examples that can be applied in each of our communities, in each of our ministries. I had a pleasant surprise when I heard of his work in Nicaragua, because he has been in the board for Opportunity International, who's a microfinance organization that is also working in community development. And he's been doing that back at home for over 8 years. So when I went to the site for Opportunity International, I found a video of an artisan that is featured there. And to my surprise, of all the Nicaraguan artisans they could feature, they had there Doña Mayra Ramirez, who is an artisan that my mother used to work with, because we had a store. And so we used to buy product from this lady, and there she was saying that her sales had been duplicated because of her work through Opportunity International. But you see, besides what you could see in her, the numbers and all of that, what I loved about Dr. Lupton and what I saw in there is just the focus on each individual person. The beauty of that, the beauty of hearing that lady say that she had hope for her future, that she had her, her dignity was being affirmed and her talent was being affirmed. She was being given an opportunity to use what God had given her. And when we think of our communities, when we think of how we can best serve, I pray that the Lord may send His Holy Spirit and show each of you, show each of us how we can honor him in this way, in a way that acknowledges that we are to be his reflection, in a way that helps us to not be afraid of the challenges, because I tell you, he's going to present a very different way of thinking, but he does it in a loving way. And it's been a blessing to learn from him, and it is my prayer then, and that we're all open to his message, and my honor to introduce him, Dr. Bob Lupton, presenting Toxic Charity. Thank you.
Yeah, let's see. "42 years ago tonight, I was in the jungles of Vietnam. That was the conflict of the day. And in those days, we had a draft. And if you didn't have a college deferment, you were just scooped up and sent to the war. I thought that this would be the most wasted year of my life. But I found myself surrounded with a whole lot of young men from inner cities across the country who brought with them all sorts of problems. Drugs over there were very, very pure and very cheap. And a lot of those kids got strung out pretty badly. And somehow I was able to help set up an amnesty drug abuse program for those kids. Set up some high school GED classes so that they could graduate from high school, even started some college courses. It ended up being a rather redemptive year, and one that actually changed the course of my life. It was in that environment that God began to shape within me a sense of calling to work with troubled young men. When I came back to the States and out of the military, that sense of calling would not leave me alone. And eventually, I left my business career. I met with a juvenile judge in Atlanta and told him what I wanted to do, work with some kids on probation. And his response was not particularly positive. He said, "I've seen you fly-by-night religious types come in and out of this court for years." He said, "Frankly, I think you do more harm than you do good." But he said, "If you want to work with some kids," he said, "I'll give you some that you can't hurt." And so that's where I began, with 12 young boys on probation, that it was quite clear that I was not going to hurt them. It didn't take very long to figure out that if you're going to work with troubled kids, you got to be involved with their families, what's happening in their home situations. And so I went back to school, learned how to work with families, and expanded the work to include parents, siblings of those young probationers, only to discover that you can't work with struggling families very effectively apart from the environment that impacts on them every time they step out of the door. And so I began to be more involved with what was going on in the street and with the police and in the schools. And over time, it became clear to me that if you wanted to change an environment, the best way to do it was become a part of that environment. It was at that time that I met our speaker from last night, John Perkins. And John told me that becoming a neighbor was a very, very important move. John messed my life up. That insight about becoming a neighbor and moving into the city is an insight that one does not share quickly with one's spouse, especially when you're in the process of building her new dream home a little farther out in the suburbs. I kept that feeling to myself. We were about 5 weeks away from moving into our new home. That's a period of time when you're picking out the carpet and the cabinetry and the light fixtures. This is high energy time. I remember when it happened, Peggy and I had gone to bed early, and she just wanted to talk. And I said, "I don't think you want to talk to me tonight." And she said, "Oh no, what's wrong?" And I came out with it. I said, "I don't think God wants us moving farther out of the city. I think He wants us moving into the city." That was a bad night. In the morning, Peggy said, "Is this your idea or God's idea? Because if it's your idea, I'm not interested at all." She said, "I want it in writing from God if I could get it." And so for the first time, I wrote out a 7-page letter. "John, I just blamed you for my move into the city." Say more. And so I wrote out what I felt was a call of God, and she took that letter around to her girlfriends and our small group leader and our pastor, and concluded that at least I believed that this was a call of God. And if a call of God, what choice do you really have? And so it's a tribute to Peggy's spiritual depth that she gave up her vision of a home in the suburbs where our 2 boys could be in a safe environment and go to good schools and become a part of the kind of environment that she enjoyed growing up. Gave that up and moved into the heart of Atlanta, into an environment that seemed strange and foreign and dangerous. That was about a 10-year learning curve. During that 10 years, we had been ministering to the kids and the families, and had gotten the use of an old Presbyterian church that closed down, and started doing programs out of that church, the kind of programs that are pretty natural to start up: clothes closet, food pantries, that sort of thing. One of the programs that was particularly exciting, that I gave a lot of energy to, was our Adopt a Family program at Christmas time. We would give the names of kids in the neighborhood who were not going to get anything for Christmas, or at least not very much. Give those names, the ages, sizes, to caring people from around the city who would go shopping, and they would, on Christmas Eve, come and deliver those toys to these children in their homes. And it created a lot of excitement. But the first year that we were in the neighborhood, it was the first time that I really had time to be in the homes of some of the recipient families when the gift-bearing families arrived. And I saw something that I just had never seen before. The kids, of course, were all excited. They were jumping up and down. The moms were perhaps a little reserved, perhaps a little embarrassed, gracious. But if there was a dad in the household, he just disappeared. He was gone out the back door. And it dawned on me what was happening was that these parents, in front of their own kids, were being exposed for their inability to provide. It was hurting their pride. The moms would endure that indignity for the sake of the kids. But it was more than a father's pride could handle. It was as though his impotence was being exposed in front of his wife and kids in his own living room. It was killing him. I never realized the toll that it was taking on the lives of those who were recipients of our charity. Very, very disturbing to me. In those days, there were very few urban books that were written. John's book was one of those early ones, and so I was reading everything I could get my hands on urban work, urban ministry, I came across a French philosopher theologian by the name of Jacques Ellul. I was reading one of his books, and this quote jumped off the page at me. Almsgiving, that's charity, almsgiving is Mammon's perversion of giving. It affirms the superiority of the giver. It binds him and demands gratitude. It humiliates him and reduces him to a lower state than he had before. Can you see why that hit me right in the heart? That was not why we came to the city, not to hurt or humiliate. We came to build up. We came to encourage. We came to build community. And I was discovering that the kind of charity we were doing was doing just the opposite. It was robbing people of their dignity. And it made me wonder, what about all of the other things that we were doing? And we had started, in the church, we started a clothes closet. That's pretty easy to do in our culture. We don't wear out our clothes in this culture, except maybe the men do. So we opened up a clothes closet in our church and said, these are the free gifts of God's people. They've been given freely. You receive them freely. And it was a beautiful spirit until we actually opened the doors. And folks came elbowing their way in and grabbing up as many clothes as they could stuff into as many bags and carry out. And I'd find the clothes scattered around the community. Didn't have any place to try them on. And I thought, well, this isn't very good stewardship. And so we said, we need to put some rules, to post some rules on this. And so we did. We said limit the number of visits per month and limit the number of garments that folks can get each visit. Posted those rules, and it was just like saying, let the games begin. Can I get some garments for my kids that are in school? Well, that's reasonable. Can I get some garments for my sick uncle who can't come in here today? You see where it's going. In no time, we're behaving like temple police, guarding the resources of the kingdom against the very folks we were there to serve among. It turned into an adversarial relationship almost overnight. It was not what we had in mind. We had in mind building community, interdependency, sharing lives together, and we end up being in an adversarial relationship. The food pantry, well, it wasn't much better. It was hard to get that equitable. Somebody give us a couple dozen canned hams. Those are pretty popular. Well, you have 50 people standing in line. How do you distribute that equitably? And somebody gets canned corn and somebody gets pickled beets. But they have to express gratitude. It demands gratitude. And so just underneath the surface, there's a good bit of dissatisfaction. I started looking at the nonverbal language that folks were expressing, and it was anything but a prideful, dignified process. Shoulders a little slumped, eyes a little downcast. People who were objects of our pity. Reducing them to a lower state. Did lots of service projects. You know, when you're in a community of need, there's always lots to do, and carrying people from all around the city and different churches would come in, and we did an awful lot of good work. We fixed the leaking roofs of widows, and we actually built some houses. We cleaned out trash-strewn lots, just a lot of good work. I was sitting on my porch one day, this kind of stuff is now playing in my mind. My neighbor Virgil from across the street is sitting there with me on the porch, and a 14-passenger church van comes down the street, nice and slow, and the kids, youth group, they're looking out, waving. Virgil said, "I hate it when those volunteers come down here." I said, "Really?" I said, I thought you liked volunteers. Volunteers built your house. And he said, "Oh yeah," he said, "they do good, but," he said, "they insult you, and they don't even know they're insulting you." And he tells me about one woman that was a volunteer in his home who was going on and on about how neat and clean his house was. He said, "I know she meant it as a compliment, but," he said, "I know what was behind that she expected black families in the inner city to live in a hovel." It just insults you. And one woman was raving about his children, how bright and how well behaved they were. He said, "I know she meant well, but I know what was behind it, that she's surprised that my kids were not rowdy and dumb." He said, they just insult you. Don't know it. Well, we tried mission trips. Everybody does mission trips, right? And so with our church, we said, let's make a long-term commitment, do this right. And so a bishop in Honduras hooked us up with a little village, and we went in. The first thing that we noticed was people carrying water. No water supply anywhere near there. And of course, that's the first thing we saw. And we said, that needs to change. We've got the capacity, the connections, and we dug them a well. And it was wonderful celebration in the village when water came gushing out of the ground. Making a long-term commitment, so the following year when we came back, the first thing we noticed was women are carrying water again. We said, "What happened to the well?" And they said, "Well, it broke down." And so we fixed the well. And the following year when we came back, the women were still carrying water. And we said, "What's the matter with the well? It broke down." Year after year, they just waited for us to come back to fix our well. Well, the bishop that hooked us up finally came to our pastor quietly. It took 10 years. He said, "It might be better if you would find some other place to serve." He says, "There's just some unhealthy dependency going on here. It's bad when you get kicked out of a third world country. But when I looked closer at our mission trips, what I found was that the outcomes of that were not any better than the outcomes of our charity work in our community. I was talking with a micro lender, a Nicaraguan banker who had left his practice and gone into micro loans, little loans for peasant people to help them build up their businesses. And I was asking him how he worked with the churches down there, and he kind of skirted the issue a bit. And I said, "No," I said, "I'm really interested in how you engage with churches." And he said, "Bob, there's whole sections of our country that we can't do any micro lending in at all." He said, "Those are the areas where there's a concentration of U.S. church partnerships." He said, "My people say, 'Why do we want to borrow money?' They give it to us. 'Why do we want to borrow money to build a church?' They build it for us." And then he got very serious, and he said, "Bob, they're turning my people into beggars." I had the Consul General of Honduras call me. A lawyer on her staff had given her a copy of that little toxic charity book, and she said, "We've got to talk." We got together. She said, "We have 15,300 NGOs functioning in Honduras, U.S.-funded nonprofits. 15,300. And she said, "They are ruining my country. Something wrong with the charity we've been doing." Well, I had to look at myself. Did I enjoy a superior position? Did I demand gratitude? Well, it's certainly a whole lot better to give than to be on the receiving end of that. And I think I cloaked my sense of pride in a cloak of humility, but it sure felt good to help people. I noticed as I looked closely at our giving, I noticed a downward regression that seemed to take place every time. You give somebody something once, and it elicits appreciation. Oh, thank you very much. This is a surprise. This is a delight. Thank you so much. You do it a second time, and it creates a little bit of anticipation. Oh, wonder if they're going to do this again. Wonder if they do that sort of thing. By the third time, you've created an expectation. Oh, you do this, when's it going to come again? I'm expecting that. By the fourth time, you've created an entitlement. I don't want a turkey for Christmas. I want a ham. I'm entitled. I have a voice in this. And by the fifth time, you've created dependency. You can't stop now. We're counting on this. An unhealthy downward spiral that I saw repeating itself over and over again in the way we were doing charity. I realized that one-way giving was producing anything but positive outcomes. It was depleting people of their dignity. It was eroding their work ethic. It was causing unhealthy dependencies. And it was not building good, healthy relationships. It was doing just the opposite. And so I said, we got to get out of this business. So he said, we're going to stop this giving, and we're only going to give to those that are in a time of real crisis. Whereupon the incidence of crises skyrocketed. Everybody had a crisis. And we said, wait a second. We've got to define the difference between a real crisis and what's a function of chronic poverty. Those are two very different things. A crisis demands an emergency response. That's when a cyclone blows through the island. That's when an earthquake hits Haiti. Now that's a crisis. And the right response to that is rush in there with food and clothing and medical supplies. Get in there, and it saves lives. That's the right response. A chronic need, on the other hand, requires a development response. After the crisis is passed, lives are saved. Now it's time to start rebuilding. Rebuilding homes, rebuilding businesses, rebuilding lives, rebuilding schools. It's time for development. If you meet a crisis with an emergency response, lives are saved. On the other hand, if you address a chronic need with an emergency response, people are harmed. I'll give you an example of that. Recently, I was in New Orleans. Some of you remember 8 years ago when Katrina hit New Orleans and people were stranded on the tops of buildings, and we saw it on TV every night. That was a crisis. And the response of the nation was, it was not very pretty, but it was the right response. And it was an emergency response from all over the country. And it saved lives. We lost lives, but it saved lives. When I was in New Orleans a couple of months ago, there were people coming in from different churches and service groups from all over the place, bringing food, clothing, other kinds of things to give away to the victims of Katrina. You get that? Victims of Katrina. 8 years, we've created a victim culture. because we stayed on an emergency relief agenda when it should have shifted within 6 months or at least a year after the crisis passed. Should have shifted to development. So what do? We said we've got to change this. We said, first of all, we're going to narrow our focus. We can't minister to people all over the south side of Atlanta. We've got to narrow it down to our neighborhood. That way we can at least have accountable neighborly relationships with folks. Chances of building decent relationships are increased. So we'll narrow the focus. And then change our mindset. Instead of seeing folks as people in need, begin to see folks as people created in the image of God that have all kinds of capacities and abilities, perhaps not fully developed, but people who are richly gifted of their Creator, who have a desire, who have a created instinct to become all that God has created them to be. We need to start seeing our neighbors as people with resources and begin to believe that no one is so poor in our neighborhood that they have nothing to contribute. Nobody's that poor. Everybody has something to contribute to the community. Even homebound elderly people. You know, those are the ones that are looking out the Venetian blinds, always watching what's going on out there in the street, and they're talking on their phones to each other. There's your crime watch. Nobody knows better what's going on in the street than those elderly folks. Kids, little kids, troublesome kids, those are the kids, that's our leadership. Those are the ones that can start working with what we've taught them with the younger kids and bring them on up so that by the time they're in high school, they are contributing members to youth development in that community. Everybody has something of worth to bring to the table. I think it becomes the responsibility of those of us who have leverage, those of us who are stewards of resources, to create those systems of reciprocity that enable our neighbors to engage in constructive activity that enhance the life of the community. It becomes our responsibility as stewards of resources, I believe. And then we adopted what for us has become the golden rule of service. Never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. When you do that, that depletes dignity. It disempowers people when you take from them responsibility that they could and should shoulder themselves. And so with those new marching orders, we waded into changing our paradigm. That Adopt a Family for Christmas program, the second year as folks started calling in, we said, will you give an extra gift this year? Will you give a gift of dignity to the dads? And here's how you do it. Go shopping, buy you the toys, but don't wrap them. Bring them in, we'll set up a little, we'll call it the old toy shop, storefront across the street from the church, and we'll put somewhere between a wholesale and a yard sale price on those toys. And we'll invite parents to come in and go shopping. So on Christmas morning, the parents in our community will have the same joy that most parents in our society have of seeing their kids open the gifts that they have picked out, they have earned, and purchased through the efforts of their own hands. And if they don't have money, well, we're creating cash flow here. That means we can hire them so that everybody can purchase toys for their kids. And on Christmas morning, there will be dignity in the process of exchange. Well, that's a quantum leap, getting folk to let us sell the toys that they bring. But when we explained that what a kid needs more than a toy for Christmas is an effective parent. That's what they need. And we're going to take that money and we're going we're going to turn that into a training program for unemployed parents. Train them and move them out into the economic mainstream so that they will be generating income that can support their own children. And that Christmas gift that you give will just keep giving all year long. We learned something very significant that first Christmas when we did this kind of, we called it Pride for Parents promotion. We learned that parents in our community would rather work to earn, to purchase the toys that they knew would bring delight to their kids than they would stand in the free toy lines with their proof of poverty and accept the toys that somebody else has purchased for their kids. We learned that. We learned another thing. We learned a universal truth. Universal. That's all people, all times. We learned a universal truth. Everyone loves to find a bargain. Universal. Peggy came home this past Christmas season. She'd been out doing a day of Christmas shopping, and she unpacked her packages and put her treasures all around the living room for me to admire them. And she said, "And you know what?" She said, "I saved more than I spent." Now I'm not an economist. Don't quite know how those economics work. But I'll tell you one thing, she was excited about finding bargains. Universal. Why do you think it would be a blessing to the poor to exclude them from the process of finding bargains? Clothes closet. Well, that adversarial relationship, I said it's got to change. I was sharing that with a Methodist men's group who had helped us collect clothes. And I said, it's not working out the way I thought, and it's adversarial. We have to guard against folk. Oh, they said there's a simple answer to that. You know how those that aren't there always have the simple answers. They said, oh yeah, it's called the market. You put a fair rate of exchange on a desired commodity, it cuts all that out. Really? Oh, yeah. Would you guys help us set that up? And they had a meeting and said, yeah, we'll take that on as our men's missions project this year. And those guys set about doing what they can't help doing in their sleep, anyhow. Got to have a business plan. Traffic flow patterns. Got to be on a bus line. Real estate research. Shop the competition. We got to bring this in right underneath that Salvation Army thrift store. They said if we do this right, this thing will enable us to hire folks in the community, train them in retail merchandising, move them out into the economic mainstream. Takes about 2 years, they said, for a small business like this to break even, and they were right about 18 months later. That little store moved into the black economically and has been a bright spot in the community ever since. It changed the dynamic totally between that adversarial relationship between giver and recipient, where you have to guard against the recipient and make sure they don't get too much. That change was replaced by the relationship between merchant and customer. Merchants need customers. We needed the dimes and the dollars of our low-income neighbors to pay the light bill, to make payroll. We needed them, and boy, they sensed that. And then it was a question of not how do you limit what they buy, it's how do you get them to buy more. We need them to buy. And so the discussions that began, so we have 4 trainees in the store, and they're saying, how do we get customers to keep coming back? And one of the women said, well, we sure ought to get everybody's name down. You know, they knew some neighbors, many they didn't. And ought to get somebody's name down and see if you can find out something about them that make sure we write that down. So Miss Jones comes into the store, and she's greeted with, "Good morning, Miss Jones. How are you this morning? How's your mama doing?" Everybody likes to go where everybody knows their name. We could do a sitcom about that, couldn't we? So we jump in the van, go out to the shopping malls, and shop those little stores, see how they do it out there. And the debrief was just fascinating. They said, well, the people are very, very friendly. You walk into those stores, and there's the latest fashion arrivals right there. And then they have the sales racks, big signs on them, and all the hangers are going the same way. And they have them sized, some even color coordinated. They're writing this down. And one of our trainees said, "Yeah, and those stores smell nice too." But you know, when you're dealing with used clothing, sometimes it's a little stale smell. You can't dry clean everything. So they got into quite a discussion about how to make the store smell nicer. And one of the women said, "Well, if you had a pot of coffee going in the morning, that'd help." Another one said, "Yeah, if you had some microwave cookies going in the morning, that'd help." And so as customers come into the store, the aroma of fresh coffee and fresh baked cookies greets their nostrils. That communicates we value you. We want you. We need you. We found out in that process, we discovered a magical gift of God. It's called the economy. And it goes like this. This guy over here has a bumper crop of corn this year, more than his family can eat. And this woman over here, her tomatoes have come on strong. She's got many more tomatoes than her family can eat, and they come to the bargaining table, and they work out an exchange of so many ears of corn for so many tomatoes. And if the exchange is done well, they both go away feeling like they got more than they brought. That's magic. That's why Peggy was so excited about her Christmas shopping. She got more than she brought. It's how the economies of the world function. It's how wealth is created. We call it the balance of trade. It's an absolute delight to participate in the process of legitimate exchange. Why do we think that it would be a blessing to the poor to exclude them from that process of exchange? Our food pantry, well, one of our staff guys, as folks were coming in the food line on one of the Wednesdays, he said, does anybody here, would anybody be interested in being a part of a food co-op? And they said, what is that? And he said, well, you put in $3 and we combine it with our food pantry, some of our budget, and we go over to the Atlanta Metropolitan Food Bank, and we can buy food, surplus food, real cheap over there, and it could be a real bargain. And so there were 13 women that said, we're interested in that. And they put in their $3, and our staff guy went over and picked up the food. When he came back, it was a lot of food. It was somewhere around $50 worth of food for each one of them. And the word got out, wow, this is a bargain. And so more and more people signed up very quickly, and the co-op got off the ground very quickly. Now, one of the first issues that came up was our staff guy was not bringing back the right assortment of food for everybody. And so he said, well, why don't you just choose a buyer? Somebody can take your grocery list and do the shopping for you. It was the first organizational step. of a group of formerly prideless recipients. The next thing that came up was credit. What do you do if somebody doesn't have their $3 this week? Do we extend them credit? Well, that's not our decision to make. That's the decision of those that have the skin in the game. It's their $3 that's being put at risk, so it's their decision. And they have quite a debate over who's credit worthy, and somebody doesn't pay, do you kick them out? And so there's quite a discussion. And somebody said, hey, we need to be taking notes. We're making some decisions here. Somebody volunteered to take notes. Second organizational step, a secretary. And then the discussion was, well, who's going to keep track of who's paid and who hasn't, and who owes us and who doesn't? We need somebody that can be our treasurer, and somebody volunteers for that. You see what's happening? The gifts of the people, the gifts of the body start coming out, and community begins to form, and they're starting to address each other's needs. There's a sense of independency. No loss of pride here. They're a part of a buying club. They own it. Discussions happen around food a lot, and one of the women mentioned that said that Mabel's sweet potato pie was to die for. And so they said, Mabel, come on, bring in a pie next food day. And she did, and everybody had a sample, and oohed and awed. And that gave rise to other folks saying, well, I'll bring in my recipe. And before long, they're kind of sampling each other's culinary skills. And so then a couple of them come to our co-op leader and said, could we fix a meal here at the church from the food that we get from the co-op? I said, sure, that'd be fine. And so then they start preparing meals for each other at noon, which eliminates the need for suburban churches to come in to bring a hot meal to the poor of our community. They're doing it themselves. You see what's happening. Community is emerging. We have 6 of those co-ops going today, 50 households each. That's feeding a lot of mouths. And there is dignity in the process of exchange. Service projects, well, I said to Virgil, should we just not have those anymore? Are they just more trouble than they're worth? And he said, no. He said, no. He said, they do good. He said, I'll tell you what would help. He said, if we were the ones deciding on what projects were important to us, and we made those decisions, write that down. Community initiated. He said, I'll tell you another thing. He said, if we did the organizing of that and we managed those projects, that would work better for us. Write that down. Community led. And then he said something that really hit me. He said, you know, some of those Christians come in here and treat us like the least, the last, and the lost. He said, they have no idea how God is at work in our lives. They have no idea what it's like to live by faith, and when the food is run out and we only have God to cling to, how God comes through to us and does miracles. He said, they don't know anything about that kind of faith. He said it would sure be good if we had the opportunity to sit down with them and share God's work in our lives. Write that down. Make sure that there's time for mutual evangelism to go both ways. And so those became our marching orders. I realized that as serving people, we were lacking a good code of conduct. Some 400 years before Christ, a fellow by the name of Hippocrates, a physician, was a little concerned that physicians in his day did not have a code of conduct. They were making life and death decisions. They were playing God, and they didn't have a good code of conduct by which to evaluate, limit their practices. And so he came up with a set of guidelines for physicians. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, they called him. And he came up with what has been termed the Hippocratic Oath. And to this day, physicians take the Hippocratic Oath. It's their code of conduct. I thought, why don't we have something like that for us who are in the service, ministry, business? And so I gave it a shot. And I'll leave that with you tonight. Here it is. That's our golden rule for helping. I will never do for others what they have the capacity to do for themselves. To do that is to disempower people. Number one. Number two, I'll limit my one-way giving to crises and seek always to find ways of legitimate exchange. 3, I'll empower by hiring, by lending, by investing, and the gifts or grants that I give, I'll use sparingly, but as incentives to reinforce achievements. 4, I'll put the interests of the poor above my own or my own organization's self-interest, even when that means setting aside my own agenda. One of our staff was in Africa at a international education conference, and during one of the breaks, she and some other educators from around the globe were sitting talking, and the subject of mission trips came up. And one of the African educators said, there's something about you Americans that I have never really understood. She said, what is it about you that likes to paint so much? She said, in my village, when the Americans were coming, they let us out of school early and tell us to go out and take mud and stones and trash up the outside of the building so that the Americans would have something to paint. She said, my whole school building was painted 4 different times the 3 years I was there. She said, I just never figured it out. Whose agenda, huh? I'll listen carefully to the spoken and unspoken needs, knowing that many clues are hidden. We had a group recently come back from Haiti. And during their visit there, they were going through one village and noticed that there were mothers sitting alongside the road, and they had their babies wrapped up in newspaper and dirty rags. And it just touched their hearts. And so they went into the city and bought up a bunch of new baby blankets and brought those baby blankets out and distributed those to those moms so that they would have something clean and warm to put their little ones in. And the following day, when they came back, they saw those blankets in the little shops along the street. Those women had sold those blankets. And they were incensed until they were told they sold them for food. The real need was food for those babies. Unspoken needs. Sometimes it requires us to hang around a long time before we see the real needs. And then, the last one, this is the same one that is the final statement of the Hippocratic Oath. It's the same one, word for word. Here it is. Above all, to the best of my ability, I will do no harm. Amen? Amen.